Lynn. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us. Let's see. Zoe's taken a couple of restorative justice classes, a circles class and a high impact dialogue class with both Liz and I. She used to live in Denver, but now lives about 2 miles away from me, right down the street. And she's been volunteering for us in our community group conferences in restorative justice, and her understanding of neurodivergency has been really fabulous for us and for the kiddos that we're seeing who are struggling. So thank you so much for that. So we thought that she has an organization. I will put it in the chat. Spiramind. And I thought her a presentation around neurodiversity. We have really, I don't know about other practitioners, but I'm sure Lynn D'Souza and public education is, and a lot of you, I'm sure, conscious of some of the issues that kiddos are bringing to the places that we see them in. So yeah, I'll let you take it from there, Zoe.
Okay. I am not super familiar with WebEx, so I'm trying to. Okay, I lost you all. Can you see my screen now?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. And let me put you so I can see you and my screen. Okay, cool. Yeah, I just am really, really excited to be doing this presentation with you all and having this conversation with you all. And I have found it, yeah, really rewarding over the last year or so to be working with Lynn and with Liz in particular. Both of you have really changed my life. And I just, yeah, I'm really grateful for the opportunities and things that you all have helped me with. So I'm excited to be here and I'm excited to be talking to you all because I think, especially like what Lynn was saying in some of the conferences that I've participated in, yeah, it just the kids that we have been working with in those groups seem to, yeah, really resonate with some of the things that I talk about with this subject. So yeah, I'm excited to be sharing it with you all. Okay, so I want to start. Oh, sorry, my computer has been very slow recently. Okay, so I wanted to just tell you a little bit about who I am if you haven't met me before. My name is Zoe Collins, and I use she, her, hers pronouns. And I identify as autistic, disabled, and chronically ill. So I use identity first language, which means that I say that I am an autistic person and not a person with autism, and that I'm a disabled person and not a person with disabilities. Um, and those words and that phrasing, um, the identity first versus person first, you'll find that that is kind of there's kind of a generational difference in how folks tend to use those words or those phrasings. And it goes back to kind of the roots of the disability rights movement, and that historically people with disabilities were not seen as human beings at all. And so it was very important in the beginnings of this movement to really put a huge emphasis on that we are people. And that was very, very important and foundational to this movement. And movements change and grow over time. And kind of at the place that we are now, a lot of people, especially again, like I said, with that generational difference, are starting to think more about the ways that disability and neurodivergence, or autism in particular, the autistic community tends to prefer identity first language really strongly. But we're starting to think more about how these things are really part of us, and they're not something that we want to be divorced from our personhood. They're essential to who we are, or it's essential to who I am. There's no way for me to like take it off and put it back on. So that's why I use identity first language. I also like to mention when I introduce myself in this way that it's my privileged identities. So the fact that I'm white, that I come from a upper middle class household and had access to tutors in school and access to higher education. Those are things that all allow me to be openly disabled and autistic and be working in this field and making money talking about being disabled and autistic. And that is not generally like something that is a privilege for everybody who is disabled and autistic. So I like to mention that just from the beginning. I have experience in survivor advocacy. That's where I started my career, was in victim advocacy in nonprofits. I started in Baltimore, Maryland, doing legal advocacy for survivors of intimate partner violence. And then I moved back to Denver and I worked specifically with disabled survivors. And then I transitioned into more of this community education role, doing trainings, talking to people about accessibility, how to make your services accessible, that sort of thing. And yeah, over the last year, I've really tried to, I stepped back from working in nonprofits and I started my own business, Spiramind, and have been really trying to incorporate as many of these things that are not as, it's not as easy to implement some things when you're in a system. So I feel really grateful that I've been able to prioritize things like restorative and transformative justice over the last year or so. And the last thing I wanted to mention about me is that I'm not a doctor. So sometimes people come into this presentation and they are kind of expecting me to give a list of like diagnoses and how to identify them and how to like interact with diagnoses. And that's not what I'm going to be doing. And I am hopeful that throughout this conversation, it will start making sense why it's really important for people who are not doctors or people who are not coming from that medical perspective to be the ones talking about how to work with neurodivergent and disabled people. So that is a little bit about me. And today I wanted to cover some foundational basics. I know that this presentation is meant to be about neurodivergence, and it will be, but I am going to be transparent that the topic is so huge and there is so much just meaty theory behind a lot of it and behind the movement that it's really hard to cover it effectively in just an hour. So I want to, what I'm going to do is kind of share some information, offer space for conversation where I thought that it makes sense with the content. And I really would love to hear from you all and have this be like an open conversation. I love curiosity, I love questions. I also love shared learning. Like there is so much that I can learn from all of you. So yeah, I want to really try and weave those things together. And oh, I also wanted to mention that it's Earth Day and that just feels important to me to mention and talk about today and in general. And there's a lot of really important and beautiful work happening around disability justice and neurodivergence and climate change. And I just wanted to shout that out, and I can put some links. Actually, I was working on, I was reading the transcript of this morning, and how do I share? Well, I don't know where my chat is with you all in WebEx. Oh, there it is. Okay, sorry everyone, I'm not familiar with WebEx. Okay, here is a link that talks a lot about environmental justice and disability, and I just wanted to put that in there because it's Earth Day and it felt important to do. So we're going to talk about disability, ableism, disability justice as a movement, and then we're going to talk about neurodivergence, vocabulary, identity, and I'm going to talk specifically some more about autism because that's the perspective that I come from. Okay. Computer is being really slow. All right. So to start, I just wanted to define disability. It's really hard to define disability, but I think that in order to even attempt to understand neurodivergence, we also have to understand disability generally. And when I talk about the definition of disability, I really like to kind of flip between these two different definitions. The first one on the left is from the Americans with Disabilities Act, which was the civil rights law passed in 1990, which addresses discrimination against people with disabilities. And then the one on the right is more from a cultural disability justice perspective, and it is from an organization called Sins Invalid, which I'm going to quote some of the founders a few times throughout this presentation. But I think it's important to switch between these depending on the situation and to understand the legal perspective and also more of the perspective on disability from this cultural marginalized community understanding of this identity. So the Americans with Disabilities Act describes disability as a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. So a major life activity is really broad. That can be pretty much anything. So things like breathing, the way you eat, the way that you move, or the way that you communicate, the way that you see, the way that you sleep or learn. Major life activities is super, super broad, and it's broad on purpose in the law. And then the second part of that definition is a person who has a history or a record of such an impairment. So even if there's not, like if you have something that's not affecting you daily now, if it has affected you in the past, or if you have a diagnosis from the past, and it has maybe the potential to affect you now. So for example, for myself, I have asthma, and even though I take medication for it, so it's not affecting how I breathe, my major life activity of breathing. It's not affecting that daily right now. But if I didn't have access to my medication, or if something happened, it definitely could affect my breathing. So that would be considered a disability under this definition. And the last part of this definition is a person who is perceived by others as having such an impairment. That phrasing is really interesting, and it's really purposeful. I think it speaks really purposefully to folks in the deaf and hard of hearing community, and in deaf culture, a lot of people don't necessarily identify as disabled. And so this clause is really important for protecting people who don't identify as disabled from discrimination based on other people's perception of them. So that could also include maybe somebody who like has a birthmark or a scar or something on their face, and it's not something that is actually affecting any of their major life activities, but when somebody else sees that person, they might make some assumptions about how that affects them. And so that person needs to be protected under the law. That's that legal perspective. As kind of an alternative, we have the disability justice perspective, which says that disability is a word that links people of common overlapping related experiences of oppression based in navigating a world designed and defined by non-disabled people. This term has been reclaimed by people whose body minds, so that's just a word for your whole self, your body, mind, that there isn't necessarily a separation between those two. But this term has been reclaimed by people whose body minds have been medicalized and pathologized, working from an empowered perspective. So basically, the thing I like to point out and what's highlighted in these definitions is that disability is not necessarily something that is a medical experience within your body mind. There's room for disability to be understood as social and political, and it has to do also with the ways that other people perceive us and treat us. And we'll talk more about that, but I just like to point out that there's room for that understanding of disability even under the ADA definition of disability. Any thoughts or questions on those two definitions? So a couple other things I wanted to mention about disability, just from that cultural perspective again. So the CDC has the statistic that 1 in 4 people in America are disabled. And that is a huge number. That's 25% of people. And within the disability community, we pretty much agree that that number is low. It is probably much higher than that. And statistics on disability are really, really all over the place. They are not always accurate. They don't always use the same definition of disability. They often do not use the ADA definition of disability. And so statistics about disability, generally you can safely assume that they are low. Other thing I wanted to mention is that it does not depend on a diagnosis. So nothing in even that legal definition from the ADA has like a list of diagnoses or conditions that count. So oftentimes I do this presentation and somebody will ask me, oh, I have this, does that count as a disability? And that's not the way that even under the law that we think about disability. It has to do with the ways that we experience life and experience our world and that other people perceive us. So it really is not about a list of diagnoses. And there are also other reasons why it's really important that we don't depend on diagnosis. So for example, diagnosis is really inaccessible for a lot of people, either like because of financial resources or maybe their insurance, if they have insurance, maybe their insurance doesn't cover the specific test that the doctor needs to officially give a diagnosis of something. This is something that a lot of chronically ill people run into all the time, is that there's a test that could technically tell you, but it doesn't change your treatment plan or anything like that. So doctors don't recommend it, or the insurance won't cover it. And that means that you don't have a diagnosis, like you don't have medical records that state that you have this diagnostic condition. There are also huge intersectional reasons why diagnosis is not a good way to think about disability. So racism plays a huge role in misdiagnosis and underdiagnosis, sexism also, like all of these things whirl together to basically the point is don't rely on diagnosis, because that's not really the point when we're talking about disability. Kind of more from that restorative justice perspective, we know that survivors of intimate partner violence are twice as likely to be disabled or to report a disability. We also know that if you have one disability, you are much more likely to have multiple disabilities. So it's really rare actually for someone to just have one thing going on with their body. It's much more common for there to be a lot of things going on. We also know that around 60% of incarcerated people have a brain injury, which is a form of neurodivergence. And that statistic just like is mind-boggling to me. and we could talk forever about it. And if you're interested to learn more, I highly recommend talking to the Brain Injury Alliance of Colorado. They do a lot of work around incarceration and brain injury. But we also have, like, again, we're talking about statistics that are inaccurate and usually low. And the official statistic for incarcerated people is that 40% of incarcerated folks are disabled, which is lower than the number of people who have just a brain injury. So that's kind of an example of how these statistics don't match up all the time. We also know that 25% of incarcerated folks meet diagnostic, so again, diagnostic, so probably higher, but 25% of incarcerated people meet diagnostic criteria for ADHD, 9% for intellectual disability, and 9% also for diagnostic criteria for autism. So it's just something that you all, I'm sure, have already encountered and will continue to encounter in doing this work. Other thing I wanted to mention on this slide is invisible, or sometimes called hidden disabilities. Basically, the idea is that you cannot tell just by looking at somebody if they are disabled. You cannot tell from interacting with somebody for an hour or 2 hours or 3 hours, or working with somebody if they are disabled. Really the only way to know is if they tell you or if you ask. So yeah, just no assumptions about what people's abilities or disabilities are based on the way that you perceive them or the way that they look or act, even in like, even if you're working with them for an extended period of time, you can't just tell. So a question for you all that I would love if people could unmute or put in the chat. I have it open, I found it. But question for you all, why might someone choose not to identify as disabled, even if they kind of meet what we've talked about as some of these definitions? Any thoughts about that?
Zoe, I'll share. And this
Yeah.
relates to you. So so I became friends with Zoe and worked with Zoe in circle process. And Zoe noted for me that perhaps I might have ADHD. And so maybe not a choice piece, but rather a lack of awareness piece. Once that Zoe had suggested that I might have ADHD, I started learning a lot more about it. And although I'm not currently diagnosed, I'm pretty confident, and based on like now thinking back and looking at my childhood, as well as like how my mom is, as well as how my daughter is, I'm pretty confident that I have undiagnosed ADHD. So I mean, that wasn't directly responding to your question because you were more asking about the choice piece, but a lack of awareness is also a factor, I think.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that, Liz.
I work inside of DOC, or I used to, excuse me, as a therapist in DOC, and a lot of individuals would want to disclose a disability or talk to anyone about it because it could also affect their movement to a minimum yard or to community corrections if they were going to be on medication. So there's many different reasons inside of a DOC why someone would want to disclose a disability.
Yeah, that is a fantastic point. I had not considered that, but it makes a lot of sense. And it goes back to this kind of idea of safety and kind of how I introduced myself as saying that it's the fact that I'm privileged, that I am not incarcerated, that allows me to be like open about these identities, and that it's really unsafe and can have really detrimental effects on people's lives because of ableism, to disclose a disability that might otherwise be hidden. Yeah.
I think for me, Zoe, that my name's Spiro and I work with the division of youth services. You know, there's a fear-based response around it, and the idea that you can be judged for in ways that are unfair or discriminatory, that there's some type of judgment made on your abilities and your capabilities, and to be viewed as less than. So there, I think that there's a lot of that mixed into it.
Yeah, for sure. So much shaming, judgment. I think there are also, like, it's important to point out that there are cultural differences as well in how different communities and cultures view disability, and especially in America and in white America in particular, disability is very shamed. Yeah. And I'm looking in the chat, stigma, yeah, it can feel more comfortable to pass. Yeah, thank you for sharing that, for sure. Yeah. And I have a friend who is in grad school right now, and she is really struggling with like the situations that she wants to choose to disclose that she's autistic, and those situations where she doesn't want to disclose that. And so because she can pass, and the word that we use with neurodivergence is masking, that especially with a lot of practice and a lot of shame that is poured onto us from a very young age for behaving in neurodivergent or disabled ways, that we learn and internalize that shame and learn how to mask.
I think that, Zoe, I think to kind of underline what you talked about, the cultural pieces are huge. When you think of immigrant families, or a first son of a first son or something like that, or the firstborn, and having those challenges around self-disclosing or being viewed as such within the family, it's a big deal.
It is a big deal. Yeah. Okay, I'm going to move on just for time's sake, because we have lots more that we can talk about as well. But thank you, everybody, for sharing your thoughts on that. I just wanted to offer some practical tips just to kind of get started in this. I really think that talking about and being open about disability and access needs is a really fantastic opportunity for empowerment, which is what we try to do in our work anyways, all the time. So talking about people, or talking with people about the fact that they have rights, the fact that they are entitled to accommodations if they need them, things like that can be really concretely useful for somebody to practice that skill. And to learn that self-advocacy, because I think as Liz said, that just there is not a lot of information available, easily accessible about disability. And it's just not talked about. People just don't talk about disability. Like, I learned that I have a great aunt who was disabled. I learned this last week because nobody in my family ever talked about her. Until I started asking questions and really digging into my family tree, and discovered that there she was, and she had these experiences as a disabled woman however many years ago, and just nobody talked about her. So another thing, just don't base your actions on assumptions or on a diagnosis. We talked about that. And don't be afraid to just ask. Disability is not bad. It's not shameful. There's nothing wrong with it or with talking about it. And oftentimes and I found this when I was working with disabled survivors on like crisis hotlines, that it might be the first time that somebody has ever asked about it and asked about a person's needs. So that can feel really powerful. And the ways that I like to ask are, is there anything that I can do to make our work together easier for you? Or do you have any disabilities that it would be useful for us to know about? Those are kind of my go-to questions. Yeah, so I recommend using those. It can also come up later in descriptions of harm. So if somebody is not self-identifying as disabled, you might not know, they might not know, but then later you're talking about the harm or the abuse or whatever the situation is, and it might come up that, and this is an example from victim services, but we would often be talking to someone and then they would say something like, oh yeah, and then my wife flushed my heart medication down the toilet. And we pause and we say, okay, so now we have learned that this person takes heart medication and that the harm or the abuse that is happening is really specific to that person's condition, heart condition, and their access to medication, especially when we're talking about older people. There's a lot of stigma around, again, neurodivergence, things like dementia. And in the example I just gave, some of the advocacy that we ended up having to do was with this person's doctor, who just kept telling me on the phone that my client was losing his mind and was crazy, and that she was not going to refill the prescriptions anymore. So that's some of the advocacy that I've had to deal with, and that some of these folks deal with. So it can come up later. So when it comes up, kind of make note, talk about it if it feels appropriate to. You don't have to, but kind of make note, keep it in your head, because it might be more related to the situation than you think or than the person themselves realizes. So some common ones that come up for survivors of harm and also perpetrators of harm, because hurt people, right? Common disabilities are PTSD and CPTSD, as well as brain injury and physical injuries are all really, really common. So when we are talking about disability, there are kind of three major perspectives that tend to be taken. The first is the pathological model or the medical model of disability. And this is really what is the most widespread in our society. It is everywhere. I find myself falling back into this thinking often, and that's something I have to work really hard on. But it basically says that there is something wrong with a person, that if you have something abnormal going on, that should be fixed or cured, basically in order to become a productive member of society. The social model of disability is an alternative that has been gaining a lot of traction, which is great. And the social model says, well, actually, there's nothing wrong with people. People just are how they are. But there's something wrong with our society in that we don't accommodate people. So it's the societal inaccessibility that causes a disability. So it's the fact that you can't get into the place that is the problem. It's not the fact that you use a wheelchair that's the problem. And that if we were to fix all of these social access barriers, then that is what will allow all people to become productive members of society. And it's great that we are moving away from the pathological model. And also there are still some things that can be questions within the social model. So as kind of an alternative, disability justice popped up and was really founded as a movement in the early 2000s by Patty Byrne and Leroy Moore. And really they were saying, well, don't all people have value no matter what, actually? And that there are some people who just are not going to be able to do some things, and that is fine. That nothing needs to change about them or about the situation. We just need to figure it out and work together to make it better? And why are we trying to base the ways that we value people on how productive they can be? Why is that our standard for value when we think about other people? And so I love this quote by Patty. She said, "All bodies are unique and essential. All bodies have strengths and needs that must be met. We are powerful not despite the complexities of our bodies, but because of them." So when we're thinking about disability, we really want to kind of think much more systemically about it. Again, going back to that idea that disability is something that can be based on the ways that other people perceive you. And that is all wrapped up in all types of systemic oppression. So ableism, that word, you hear it and you think, oh, okay, discrimination against people with disabilities is actually a lot more complicated than that. So this is the definition that I like to offer. This is by Talila Lewis, who is a really incredible TJ activist in California, and they do a lot of work with incarcerated deaf people and making sure that they have access to appropriate interpreters. And Talila offers this definition, and I'm going to read it, and then I want to hear thoughts about it from you all, which I'm sure you will have. So ableism is a system that places value on people's bodies and minds based on societally constructed ideas of normality, intelligence, excellence, desirability, and productivity. These constructed ideas are deeply rooted in anti-Blackness, eugenics, misogyny, colonialism, imperialism, and capitalism. This form of systemic oppression leads to people and society determining who is valuable and worthy based on a person's language, appearance, religion, and/or their ability to satisfactorily produce or reproduce, excel, and behave, in quotes. You do not have to be disabled to experience ableism. So there's a lot going on in that definition, and I'm curious what stands out to you all.
Zoe, I was curious when you were speaking earlier around different, for the definition of disability, around the language justice movement and making sure people have language access, or other, whatever access they need to participate in communications. And I noticed in this definition of ableism, it does say based on person's language. I just wonder if you could comment a little bit around language justice.
I can, yes. I love language justice. It's really important, and it's really tied to disability justice. Thank you for pointing that out. Yeah, one of the examples that I give, usually the first thing that somebody points out when I give this definition is the last sentence, which is that you do not have to be disabled to experience ableism. And the example that I give when somebody points that out, I think also speaks to language justice, so I'll offer it here. That I gave this definition in a group in Southern Colorado, and there was somebody from the Indigenous community in attendance, and she offered this story, this anecdote about somebody from her community who doesn't speak English, is not white, and ended up sick, something going on, and ended up in the hospital. And while he was in the hospital, the doctors and nurses and staff, everybody there, pretty much treated him as if he was incapable of understanding the information about his own body and about what was happening with him, that he was incapable of consenting to teachers, all sorts of things. And the reason for that is because he didn't speak English. He was not given access to language justice, right? And he also was not white. And the effect that that had was that he ended up being treated as if he was intellectually disabled, which is to say that he was treated really horribly, and that that should not happen to people with intellectual disabilities either. But this man didn't have an intellectual disability, and yet he was still treated as if he was disabled because of the really complex relationship between race and language and like access to medication or medical care, right? So I hope that, does that kind of speak to what you were pointing out? Okay. Thanks. Does anyone else have thoughts or anything that stands out here?
Just the adversarial nature of all of those, you know, those convergences. I think it's you know, it's a very clear way of spelling out how to be critical of others, and that being leveraged as a means of oppression because of X, Y, and Z. So yeah, it's very telling.
Yeah, and I actually, just because of the way that you put that, I'm going to skip a couple slides ahead and put this diagram up for you all, because I think it covers pretty much exactly what you just said. That ableism, when we understand ableism as something that really connects all forms of systemic oppression, we start to see the ways that it acts as a tool for whatever group is in power in whichever dynamic we're thinking about, right? So what ends up happening is that systems of oppression, or people in power in systems of oppression, like white supremacy, colonialism, imperialism, cis heteropatriarchy, like all of these things, right? Xenophobia, there's so many. All of them really rely on this need to exploit somebody. And the tool that they use to decide like who falls into what category really goes back to ableism and understandings about what types of bodies and what types of minds, what types of people are valuable and why, and under what conditions they're valuable. So I'll read the quote again. I'm quoting Patty, but she says that the ideal body mind. So when we're thinking about systemic oppression, there usually is, like you were saying, an other. There's an othering that's happening, and there's one group that meets certain criteria, and there's a group that doesn't meet that criteria. But the ideal body mind is built upon the exclusion and elimination of a subjugated other from whom profits and status are extracted. So when a system uses an ableist lens on like what types of abilities, bodies, minds are valuable, when a system uses that to decide which people fall into which group, the people that fall into that other category can be labeled pretty much anything. And the most common, and I think poignant examples are things like deviant, unproductive, invalid or invalid, and dangerous. And that's the one that I think is really prominent in the work that we do in restorative and transformative justice, is that label of dangerous. And so like this is an example of like how we see this in incarceration, right? That there are specific types of people. Like I said earlier, we know 60% of incarcerated people have brain injuries. They say that 40% are disabled. And we have plenty of other statistics relating to race and all of these other intersectional identities, right? But If a person is labeled dangerous, then they lose rights and are therefore basically like deserving or like it's acceptable to be treating them in a certain way or to be exploiting in that situation. So I think that was a really long-winded way to say, yes, I agree with you. That is, I think, how it kind of ends up happening. I'll skip back to this definition. Did anyone else have any thoughts on this before I have another question for you too.
Zoe, I actually have lots of thoughts about this. I had been a special education teacher in a local high school for 15 years. And a lot of my kids wore helmets. They had seizures. Their IQs were like on an average of 35. And we spent a lot of time in the community. So when you go through, oh my gosh, it just takes me back there to how difficult that was to watch, how people were so afraid of my kids and were so unwilling to interact with us. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think what you're speaking to is that fear, which we talked about a minute ago when we are thinking about the ways that certain groups of people, whatever group that is, oftentimes that ends up falling along racial lines as well. But whatever group of people we're talking about gets categorized as dangerous, then yeah, they're opened up to a lot of harm. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I can't imagine how difficult that must have been to watch. And it actually kind of leads me into my next question for you all, which is, where have you seen ableism show up in your work? So that was an example from the past, but I'm curious also, where have you all seen, because I'm sure you have, where have you seen ableism show up in restorative justice work?
I think one really great example or learning experience from my life is when we put on the public policy circle last fall. There was an accessibility justice person on the panel, and I had been working really hard on putting this all together. And it was like, as soon as I saw her in the room, I was like, oh shit, we did not do all the accessibility issue things that we needed to do to make this as accessible as possible, you know, when we were like preparing in advance of it. And so luckily we were able to, you know, get transcripts and stuff, but it was really like, it was that awareness. And you also heightened that awareness for me, Zoe, but I think her name was Hannah or Hana or something, Hani or something like that. And it was just really a great reminder that it shouldn't be a secondary thought. It always needs to be a primary thought in consideration when you're putting on an event or anything, to make sure that all those accessibility pieces are also honored.
Yeah, and I just also think that it's beautiful and a really great example of the work that we do, that your comment was taking accountability for that harm, right? And it is harm that every single one of us has caused. Like I have done the same thing, which like was very shameful and embarrassing for me to have overlooked accessibility things in my work in the past, and I'm sure currently as well. Like it's a constant thing. So I wanted to thank you for that, for offering that accountability too. But yeah, it's super common. Any other ideas? Where have you all seen this?
At the risk of sounding trite, like everywhere. I think when we do a training, for instance, we don't always think, okay, are we going to do it upstairs or downstairs? Are we going to do it in multiple languages? Are we going to do it in language that's accessible? Are we going to do it? I mean, there's so many considerations that I think we regularly overlook, partly because we're just not aware of and or thinking through intentionally and or preparing adequately for, making accommodations in all the places where it might be helpful or appropriate. So all over the place is my answer.
And you all are just so on the same track as I am with how I laid these slides out. You are just going straight to the next one. So then I'll send, I have a PDF with some examples from each of these levels, but I like to talk about it as, you may have seen a diagram similar to this, as like the pyramid of rape culture, for example, is one that people are often familiar with, where you have things like locker room talk or rape jokes at the bottom, leading all the way up to the top where you have violent, like war crimes that involve sexual assault on a very large scale. So like these foundational beliefs about whatever group really lay the groundwork for escalating violence. And I think about it as a cone because I am a geometry nerd, and it doesn't make sense to me to think about these things as having angles and sharp distinctions between different intersecting identities. It really just does not make sense to me to think about them as points. So I like to think about it as a cone because all of these things we're talking about, they all swirl together. And I described this to actually a special education class that had me as a speaker it was a college class. And somebody in the audience, a Black young man, called it a swirling tornado of violence. And I like that phrasing. So I wanted to stick with it and credit him for that phrase. But yeah, the swirling tornado of violence. And I'll get you all that PDF handout as well with some examples. But because of time, and is that true? I have 15 minutes left.
You know what, Zoe, we were a little bit ahead on our agenda, so we started with you a little bit earlier than we thought. So I think we're good, I would say, up to potentially another 30 minutes if there's engagement for that, or somewhere in between this, 15 to 30 minutes.
Okay, yeah, that sounds good. That's great. So then I will give you a couple of examples, which I was going to skip if it was 15. Here's some examples of where ableism shows up, probably in things that you all have encountered in your work or that you will encounter, I'm sure. But denial of accommodations by police, judges, attorneys, pretty much anybody involved in any situation. People just don't understand the ADA laws. And also there isn't really any enforcement branch of the ADA. The only way that somebody can address harm that is caused, like within the legal system, would be to personally sue whoever denied an accommodation. And disabled people tend to not have financial resources to sue every time somebody denies them their right to accommodations, because it happens every single day. There are also extremely high rates of trauma among disabled people. There's lots of stereotypes about disability and neurodivergence. There tend to be a lot of inappropriate or outdated assessments. So people who maybe were trained in disability or neurodivergence a long time ago and just maybe are just not aware that different criteria have changed since then, or that there are different kind of standards for assessments than there were 20 or 30 or 40 years ago. Different disability standards really come into play. So like, for example, somebody who applies for SSI or SSDI and is approved for that, that is a very difficult process. and it is not the only definition of disability. So that definition of disability is very narrow, and it does not include all disabled people. So thinking about the context also of what is relevant in that moment. Denial of due process, of course, comes up all the time for lots of reasons, but especially when you're working with somebody who has neurodivergence or cognitive disabilities, making sure that they are able to access all of the information that they need and able to understand it and process it in ways that they need to. Discrimination in sentencing, confinement, and release as well. So also in release programming, really strict regulations for like going to all of your appointments, things like that, that people, especially with neurodivergence who struggle with executive functioning maybe, might have a really difficult time doing. And it's not because they don't care, it's because their brain literally works differently. A big thing that I dealt with a lot in victim advocacy was having our survivors being labeled as an unreliable witness in a case because of the people involved not being willing to do the work to understand disability, to understand accommodations, and understand how that disability affects the person that they're working with. It's much easier to just say, oh, they're an unreliable witness, and completely disregard their experience. There's a ton of VRA violations for disabled people. Excessive use of force is another huge issue that comes up for disabled people because disabled people tend to be assumed to be more violent. So things like prone restraints, which is also something that is legal and commonly used on disabled children in schools even today, and has led to lots of death of disabled children. More time served generally as consequences for things like missing court dates or whatever. So those types of things and communication expectations. All right. So I'm sure you all have thought about this question before, but if I could maybe have just one person who feels like they want to kind of give a description of what you think the difference between rights and justice might be, I would love to hear from someone in this group. For a restorative justice group, there's nobody who wants to tell me what justice is.
Okay, if nobody else wants to talk, I will again. And this is just off the top of my head. I feel like rights are what we should is a word maybe I shouldn't use. Things that we should expect to have access to, what we should be able to do, and justice is the actual application of our ability to do those things or be those things. Or
Yeah, I like that description. Thank you for offering that. Yeah, I think that is a pretty good one. That, yeah, rights are something that is supposed to be afforded to everybody, even though that's not always the case. And it's definitely something that we have to work on. And also justice takes that even further. And the way that I like to think about it, and that really resonates with me, is a description that Mia Mingus, who is a disability justice and transformative justice activist, she does a lot of work in child abuse prevention and intervention specifically. And I highly recommend you Google her. But she talks about how when we have a rights-based system, we have these, and she calls it the ranks of the privileged. So there are people who have rights up here, and there are people who don't have rights down here. And when we take a rights-based approach to disability, for example, what we're doing is and she describes it as plucking a couple of people, we're plucking a few more people and adding them up into the ranks of the privileged. But it doesn't do anything to address people who have other identities that will not be included. So, for example, like a disabled person who is an immigrant, who is not a citizen, that person, even though, yeah, we have the ADA, that person still is not going to have the same rights as everybody else. Whereas justice, right, is much more expansive. And I think it has to do a lot more with the ways that we relate to each other, and the ways that we relate to each other rooted in love and community and just to use RJ terms like generative community, generative conflict, those types of things I think are much more related to justice and can happen kind of regardless of the legal system. So kind of off of that, I wanted to show you the 10 principles of disability justice. And you can find these on SIN's Invalid, which is the organization started by Patty Byrne and Leroy Moore. And there are lengthy descriptions of each one and how they apply to disability. But I just wanted to show and read them to you and ask, what stands out to you as similar to the things that we talk about and work on in restorative justice? So the 10 principles of disability justice are intersectionality, leadership of the most impacted, anti-capitalism, cross-movement solidarity, that one stands out a lot to me, wholeness, sustainability, it's Earth Day, sustainability, super, super important, cross-disability solidarity, which basically refers to how we are stronger together, and that it would be much more difficult as a movement if we had people with intellectual or neurodivergent related disabilities fighting for their specific access needs, and we had people with physical disabilities fighting for their specific access needs, and they sometimes cross over, but you're not working together as a movement. So cross-disability solidarity means that every single disabled person is included, and we want to be thinking about access for everybody. Next one is interdependence and collective access and collective liberation. So what stands out as similar to RJ?
Number two and number one, I suppose in my mind, really have a parallel to the Venn diagram and the three, or I'm not sure how many principles or pillars from Howard's there. Matt, you'll have to help me on that one, around including the voices of those who were being inclusive of the voices of those who were most directly impacted.
Yeah. Anyone else? What stands out for other people?
I know this stands out to me. I'm just still having trouble with it's my own lack of understanding, not on you. My own understanding of the concepts here is this disability justice, this laundry list that you have here, sort of a limitation or the anti-ableism. I just don't. I think one of the problems I have is I don't know what the limiting principle. I'm a judicial officer. I don't know what the limiting principle is for your definition. It is so incredibly broad that I don't know where it ends.
I love that question and that thought, that line of thinking.
And let me give you an example.
Sure.
Where are you physically?
I'm in Colorado Springs.
Okay, you're in Colorado Springs. Colorado Springs, I'm in Fort Collins, is part of the Louisiana Purchase. right?
Yeah.
Anything west of the continental divide was Spain, right? And you know, it was a territory. It was a part of the Kansas Territory later, Colorado, and then I guess it was granted statehood in 1876, right? Centennial state. But you know, the federal government had complete ownership of the land you're sitting on, the land I'm sitting on. And so along with that, you know, there was a whole host of laws from Congress, and that Western migration, you know, was mostly done by white people, and it was pushed during the Civil War. But you know, blacks never had the opportunity to do that. But you know, here we are, a couple hundred years later, and so I just don't, you know, we're still part of that system. We're part of the Union of the United States. So I don't know where you're, you know, I get the disability justice. These are, you know, intersectionality. I had to learn about critical race theory, being a lawyer and being in a master's program, and reading about that. But I just don't know where your ableism ends. It seems to have no boundaries, which is problematic.
I am really interested in everything that you just talked about, especially in the last part of it, because what I was thinking as you were speaking was that what feels really important to me, at least, about understanding disability justice and understanding ableism, and what makes it so valuable as a way of looking at all of the things that you just described, is the fact that it is not limited, the fact that it is so broad, because it's so hard to contain our human experiences and to limit them, right? And disability is something that affects every single community everywhere. There are always people in every single group that have different abilities, different strengths, and different needs that must be met, to quote Patty again. And so disability, when we think about the ways that all of these things connect, disability is something that really unites a lot of these different movements, which I think goes to number 4 on this list of cross-movement solidarity, that the understanding that when we center disabled people, specifically Black or Indigenous or queer and trans disabled people, that experiences, like, again, thinking about that idea of, if we're talking about rights, that you're just adding a few more people up to this group and you're not addressing why there's a separation in the first place. And disability gives us this way of connecting all of these really diverse experiences under something that, when you center disability and accommodation and access, it actually increases access for every single other group in the world, right? Like, if that is your goal, is to increase access for disabled people, that's automatically going to create systems or create infrastructure for, like, what we were talking about, like language justice. If we center and prioritize our strategies for including ASL interpreters regularly in our events, then that is automatically going to give us a bigger capacity in the future to include more languages, to include people who are not primarily English speaking. So your thoughts, like, that is such a huge question and such a huge conversation. And I think it's really interesting that what you were talking about is what I would say and view as a huge strength of the movement. It's just really interesting. I really appreciate you sharing about it.
Yeah, I was kind of trying to be devil's advocate. So
yeah, yeah, thank you. Okay. So I want to spend the last few minutes actually talking about neurodivergence, which is what we are all here to talk about. So the first thing I want to point out is this rainbow infinity sign that's on the screen here. This is the symbol that we use to represent neurodivergence. And it is offered as an alternative to the puzzle piece, which has historically been used by large nonprofits dedicated to serving autistic families. And when we're talking specifically, or if you want to use a symbol specifically for autism, we would use a gold infinity symbol. And the rainbow says all neurodivergence. So the first thing I want to do is just cover some vocabulary, just so we all know what words I'm using as we go through this section. The first is neurodiversity. This is just the same as how we would use diversity on its own. It refers to the natural human variant diversity, specifically of neurocognitive functioning. So when we say neurology, we are talking about the brain and the nervous system. So your brain and your spinal cord are all included when we say neuro or neurology. So it's not just your brain, it also includes like the way that you move. So if you've noticed me, I have been spinning in my spinny chair this whole time because the way that my autism and my ADD combine, I need to be moving all the time. The next one on here is neurotype. This is not really like, there aren't specific delineations. It's more about kind of these patterns that we tend to see in sets of different traits. So an autistic person probably has some things in common with other autistic people. Somebody with epilepsy probably has some things in common with other people with epilepsy. There's, of course, everybody is different, but we see some general trends. And that's what we say when we, or that's what we mean when we say neurotype. Neurotypical is a word for the most common or expected, to kind of go back to that definition of ableism, the most common or expected neurotype or set of traits. And neurodivergent is anything that's different from that. The one note I will make about language that is really important to me is that one person is neurodivergent, not neurodiverse, because one person cannot be diverse. However, like this group on this call right now is neurodiverse because I can be fairly certain that we all do not share the same neurotype as each other. So we are neurodiverse. A group of all autistic people would not be neurodiverse, though we are all neurodivergent. So that's a distinction that I see used incorrectly often. So that's just, yeah, a vocab note. And then the last one on here is like a bonus word. I'm not going to talk much more about it, but neuroqueer is a way that I identify sometimes. And it really talks about the ways that gender and sexual identity also interact with and are related to neurocognitive functioning and divergence from what is expected or what is normal in terms of gender and sexuality and the ways that we move and express ourselves and all of that. So, question for you all, what does it mean to be neurotypical? We often are asking or talking about what is abnormal or divergent without ever really thinking purposefully about what is normal and why. So what do you think it means to be neurotypical? For time's sake, I am going to give you a list. So the way that I think it is really important to frame a list like this is, again, going back to thinking about systems, thinking about that really broad definition of ableism and how it is something that ties together all of these other systemic oppressions. I've been learning a lot about compost recently, and mushrooms and like the mycelium. And I really think ableism, I'm thinking back to, and I can't see your name, but the conversation we just had about how broad it is. And I'm thinking about how broad mushroom, like fungi bodies are, that they go under the ground and they tie everything together and are spongy and like, that's what I'm thinking about when I'm thinking about ableism today on Earth Day. But when we talk about neurotypical traits, it's important for us to be thinking about like why these things are desirable. Why are these the things that make the list in your child development college class? Like, why are these the things that are important in our culture? And like, is that something we agree with or not? So if your developmental skills are on track with same age peers, so that might be reading level, speech ability, movement, socialization, intellectual abilities, emotional skills. And oftentimes with neurodivergent people, we're kind of either ahead of or behind our same age peers in different categories at different times. So for example, I was reading super early, but I was not like on track with my same age peers in terms of my emotional skills for a very long time. Someone who learns as expected within a typical school dynamic, which tends to be really fast-paced, really social, really verbal and written. Someone who participates in complex social structures or settings and enjoys that. Someone who has predictable or typical processing and reaction to sensory information. So, for example, if I, as an autistic person, am in the room with my partner who is allistic, which is a word for not autistic, and we both hear the same loud noise outside the window. Like a few weeks ago, there was a car crash on our street, and the way that that literally affects my nervous system, my fight or flight response, my like sympathetic nervous system activation, is literally different than the way that it affected my partner in that moment. He was able to get up and go look out the window, see what the noise was. Whereas for me, I was unable to move or speak or like think for probably about 10 minutes before I was able to regulate myself. So that is an example of my partner having a predictable reaction to a loud noise. Oh, that was loud. What is that? Let's go check it out. Versus me really having a very hard time like physically understanding that noise. Somebody who intuitively picks up on and follows social norms, which are different in different cultures and different locations, right? But things like talking volume or conversational flow, personal space, facial expressions or affect, if you are picking up on those things and doing them without thinking about it, then that is kind of what's expected. And also having an expected set of interests. So the question I have here is about how do you think racism influences this idea of neurotypical? And for time, I'm gonna keep going and just offer that the example that I would encourage folks to ponder about this is things like the school to prison pipeline and how kids who display behaviors or maybe reactions to things in their environment that are not expected. White students are much more likely to be referred to the school psychologist for diagnostic testing for disabilities or neurodivergence, and children of color are much more likely to be suspended or expelled and put on that pathway. So basically what I am leading up to this whole time is thinking about neurodivergence not so much as a medical identity or a medical experience, but more of as an identity, something that is inherent to yourself as a neurodivergent person, whatever type of neurodivergence that might be, thinking about it in terms of culture and community, the ways that we have different cultural norms with neurodivergent people, whichever type. Like, for example, people with ADD, we tend to interrupt each other all the time, and that's not rude. That is like encouraged. Like, I love to be interrupted because otherwise I'll talk forever. So that is like a piece of ADD culture. And it's also like, that's not just even specific to neurodivergence. That is something that varies based on world cultures as well. So when we're thinking about neurodivergence, practically and in real life, you are going to most likely encounter it as people listing diagnoses. So the ones that you are probably going to encounter are things like autism, ADHD, any learning disabilities, intellectual developmental disabilities, epilepsy, Tourette's, brain injuries, OCD, and lots of other different, like just anything that is differing from what is expected for your neurological functioning. It's an umbrella term, so it includes tons and tons of things, but we've talked a lot about the problems with medical diagnoses, that it doesn't account for intersectional experiences, talked about school to prison pipeline. Sexism plays a huge role in this as well. Girls are very highly underdiagnosed with autism and ADHD, and that goes back to sexism and again racism as well, in the ways that our like studies were originally done on like what does ADD look like. And girls are socialized very differently than boys are. We're socialized to hide any signs of distress. Other things like financial access, immigration status. But really what I want us to be thinking about is neurodiversity being much more closely related to things like racial diversity, gender diversity, and sexuality diversity than to medical concerns. And that we have a history of this too, that this is not like the first time that somebody has suggested that we kind of rethink about something that has been pathologized, right? So as an example, queer people were and continue to be, in a lot of cases, medicalized and pathologized and seen as having a mental disorder, right? And in need of conversion therapy to fix their medical problem. So this idea is not new. We also know that race has been medicalized and pathologized for a very long time. Even things like IQ tests were specifically literally meant for the purpose of excluding Black people from access to certain things and trying to prove that Black people were not as intelligent as white people. So these things are all super, super related. And no, I'm out of time. Yeah, so basically the last thing I want to say here is that when we are talking about neurodivergence or autism as an identity, we also want to honor that people can self-identify however they want. So if somebody does not resonate with this term neurodivergence or does not like want to be thinking about it as part of their identity, that's okay. You don't have to. That's totally fine. Sorry, it's very windy where I am, and there's a lot of noise happening. But when we're thinking about neurodivergence as an identity, it is necessary to combine that thought with what we have been talking about already with disability justice. Because if we don't combine it with these ideas that everybody is valuable for different things, like that we can't be basing our like worthiness on ideas of normality and productivity, all of those things from that long definition, we have to be thinking about how there is nothing wrong with needing support. So when I say that my autism is, and my neurodivergence is an inherent part of my identity, that is not saying that I don't struggle, because I struggle a lot with a lot of things all the time. And ideally, we would live in a world where we are all able to access the support that we need without shame, and that needing support wouldn't lead to being dehumanized. So you have to kind of combine these two. And that's why I spend so much time talking about disability justice as an intro to talking about neurodivergence as identity, because if you don't combine those things, then you kind of get into this idea that, and the ways that some people talk about autism as like a superpower or like that type of phrasing, where okay, yeah, but also I really struggle a lot, and that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. So I know I'm at 2:30 and I just talked a lot, but I can stick around if there are any last thoughts or questions.
Yeah, Zoe, that was fabulous. Thank you so much. And I'm wondering if to thank you, and also for people to sort of be able to speak sort of what stood out for you, maybe just a quick round, just if there's one thing that really stood out for you in what Zoe shared with us, just popcorn it. Yeah. I can start. I mean, it's practically the very first thing you said I found super important and something I really need to think about. And that was moving away from what so many of us have worked on towards sort of the people first, way that we talk about people, and reclaiming the inherent value and importance of the identities that people have, and that those things also remain first in people's identities. So thank you for that. Who else? Yeah, Benito.
First off, I want to say thank you. I took a lot of notes. Been in law enforcement for 26 years, and one of the things that you did mention is how do we communicate? How do we communicate with folks that may have a disability, and how do we ask those questions? So I did write down, the how do you ask people? How do you talk to them? We had a case just recently where there was a crime against. We were charging crime against somebody with a disability, and the question was asked, are you disabled, or do you have a disability? So that kind of came out wrong, and it created that communication gap to where, oh, are you just telling me because are you just doing this because I'm disabled? But now, understanding and I think bringing that education piece to law enforcement where they know how to communicate with folks, rather than creating that creating this. And but thank you. So I jotted some of those questions down, so I appreciate your time.
Who else? Or feel free to use the chat too, but yeah, speak up.
This is Lynn, so I can go really quick. Zoe, thank you so much. I am with the Colorado Department of Ed and been an educator 28 years, background special ed, positive behavioral interventions and supports. So we routinely talk to our resource officers, right, about disability and about how to interact and what it means. One thing I find so interesting is that I had heard that person first language is no longer desired, especially by the autistic community, and I didn't exactly know where that was coming from, because I've been in so long, right? We went from starting with a disability to not starting with a disability, and going back to starting with a disability. So I'm very happy to hear the background behind the movement, because that's very, very helpful. So thank you for sharing that insight.
I'm going to put a link about it also with way more resources.
Great. Yeah. Anybody else?
This is Luke. I would A, just thank you. B, I think along with some of what Judge Villaseñor was sharing, I think one of the things that's so helpful for me when we have conversations like this, regardless of the specific area of justice that we're talking about, and I appreciate the bringing all the intersectionalities into this, is that it breaks down some of the binary ways that we look at things or the ways that we tend to group things, and so much of that can be really destabilizing for those of us that carry these really long ingrained ideas about how we group things in the world and how we tend to view things, particularly for people who come from the predominant culture in many different ways. And so I just very much appreciate being destabilized in these conversations and then needing to figure out how to regain that footing in a hopefully more holistic and inclusive and broad way of viewing the world. So that's just kind of a general comment from some of the really specific and helpful things that you shared, Zoe. So thank you.
Thank you for sharing that.
I would echo everybody's thanks here, Zoe. It's a lot of great information, great awareness, and really appreciate you doing that for us.
Thank you again, Zoe. And I think Matt has captured this in a recording. So thank you also for letting us do that, to share your wisdom and all this information more broadly, both for those council members who couldn't be part of this afternoon's presentation and for others who access our resources as the Restorative Justice Council. So thank you so very, very much. Yeah, any last words, or shall we? I think we're about ready, Zoe, to move into kind of the closing of we've been in the meeting all day, so we're probably kind of moving into some closing of our meeting. You're welcome to stay.